Let's talk about your editing process. If you're anything like I used to be, you probably finish your first draft with the occasional compulsive editing skirmish along the way, and then you sit down with your entire manuscript and you start reading it from the beginning. We're off on the wrong foot, but we'll discuss why in a moment. And as you're reading through your manuscript, you're probably trying to do many things at once. You might be trying to see your writing as your reader is going to see it, to try to make it clearer and more compelling and engaging for him. And you're looking at character development and dialogue. And you're trying to make sure that the plot is consistent and coherent. And you're assessing your dramatic effect, your pacing, your style. And you're considering word choice. And you're proofreading for typos and grammatical and punctuation errors. All right, there are a lot of problems with this approach, but let's start with just the last point. If you're worried about spelling and comma splices the first time through your manuscript, I can guarantee you that you are wasting time and effort. But why? Well, let's just take the most obvious case. Supposing you're working through chapter 178 of your epic zombie romantic comedy, and you catch a zombies horde worth of little problems. And let's say it takes you half an hour to spot and to clean all of these up. And then suddenly you realize that chapter 178 actually isn't doing a great deal for your book, and really you just want to cut it out altogether. Well, congratulations, you've just lost half an hour of your life to no purpose.
And you'll never get it back.
Of course, this example is extreme. Most of the material that you excise from your text is not going to be quite so long as this. But you're still wasting your effort correcting it. Lost time is lost time, and it adds up. You have better things to be doing with your precious time than marking up sheets of paper and then tossing them in the trash. Worse and still more frustrating, suppose you proofread a section of your work, only to realize that that section is actually in need of some really serious rewriting. Well, you'll end up having proofread it twice. First before and then after the rewrite. Not the most efficient approach. Think about how publishing houses handle this. Now, time is money for a publishing house, so you can bet that the practices they follow are going to be efficient in the extreme. In publishing houses, all accepted manuscripts are subjected to not one but several cycles of editing. The first is what's generally called developmental editing, and this looks at the plot and the structure and the fundamentals of your manuscript. Now, do you think that developmental editors stoop to fossicking for mere errors in punctuation and grammar? No, developmental editors stride over your work like a colossus, tearing up buildings and trees as they go, crushing the fragile little errors of your writing underfoot in a sublime contempt. To be sure, they might mark up a mistake here or there, but that's not their main focus. Publishing houses leave proofreading to the proofreaders, and proofreading is always the last turn in the editing cycle. Follow their model. Do your proofreading last. Really, don't even bother with a spell check until you've done everything else first. I mean, sure, you can run spell check multiple times, but what's the point if you only have to do it once at the very end of the entire process? So that's the first problem. Your multifaceted approach is not as efficient as it could be. But there's a still more central issue here, and that is the question of focus. Call me extreme, but I would submit that, as a general rule, multitasking does not exist, particularly in writing and especially if you're a man. Concentrated work on a single thing is always more effective than work which is dispersed over two or three. No exceptions. You need to come at your work with laser-sharp focus and burn through one problem at a time.
Wait, what are you saying, John? Rather than reading through my manuscript once or twice, looking a little bit at everything, I've got to read through it, like a dozen straight times, looking at just a single thing every time?
Well, frankly, that would be better than what you're probably doing now. But no, I promise you, that's not what I'm saying. There is a better way, and we're going to break it down. The first question, of course, is where to begin. And here again, we could take our cues from the publishing houses and start with a good, strong developmental edit. And indeed, some of the best editors who try to transmit their process to writers will counsel you to do something very similar to this. They'll tell you to take your manuscript and put it on the shelf for 6 to 8 weeks, maybe even 3 or 4 months, and then come back at it with fresh eyes. Then they'll tell you to make a comprehensive and very detailed outline of the entire thing so that you can begin to analyze the structure of it and look for deficits. And there's something to be said for this approach. It can be effective, and it's pushing us in the right direction. But it's counting on space and time to do something for you magically that you can actually deliberately do for yourself. The editorial approach also presupposes that you should be attempting to treat your manuscript as an editor would, with a certain dispassion and detachment. The barriers of time and space are erected there for this reason. They're there to cool your ardor and to decrease your emotional attachment. The idea here is to give you an objective viewpoint, but in truth it only tends to dampen where it doesn't outright smother your creative impulse and fire. Even the language that's used here, words like developmental and structural, is very peculiar. I mean, your story is not a logical proposition. It's not a building plan. The structure to a piece of writing is a function of that writing's life. Your vision needs to flow from your creative will to give life to your story. And this is how you can infuse the revision process itself with that energy, that light, that simple childish delight that you bring to your writing process. So let's set aside outlining for the moment. And don't worry about putting your manuscript in a box for the obligatory 6-week quarantine period. Let's come back to the question of where we should begin. Well, why not start from the start? Seems like sound advice, right? Let's just sit down with our manuscript and start reading it from the beginning. Hold on. If you're anything like I am, by the time you've reached the end of your first draft, you've already read the beginning a solid 10 or 20 times. Let's be real here. Walking the same ground again and again and again will not get you anywhere new. Reading through your entire work again at this point will not avail. If you don't have a lucid aim and a way of honing in on it, you will succumb immediately to the lure of tinkering, obsessing over trivia on the mere surface of your manuscript. It would be wise to step very temporarily away from the text of your manuscript, but only with the lucid and definite objective of gaining a more intimate hold on your manuscript. The editor starts from the surface, because he has no viable alternatives. You, as a writer attempting to revision your work, you should not start at the start. You need to start with the heart.
So, what, John? You mean just open my manuscript and start revisioning halfway through?
No, that's the center. That's not the heart. The heart of your work is the spiritual core of it, which determines its character, its expression. We've already introduced this idea in a prior video where I invited you to try to gain a sense of the feeling or the soul of your work, and to try to develop at least an initial awareness of it. We're going to try to work with this more directly now. But though this is the only part of the entire revisioning project where you won't actually be expected to work directly with your manuscript, this is nonetheless perhaps the most important part of anything that we'll be doing. So I urge you to follow me with all you've got, because if you can get this right, you've won better than half the battle. To start out, it might be helpful to approach this problem from the point of view not of the writer, but of the reader. The reader comes to the book necessarily through the words on the page, and through them is drawn into the prose, the world, the storyline, the lives of the characters. To the extent that he falls in love with these things, he wants to immerse himself in them ever more completely, to penetrate to the deepest meaning and the sense and the atmosphere of the whole thing. He moves from the surface to the core. He works his way inward. He bores into it like a woodworm. The experience of the writer, however, is almost even the contrary of this. You, the writer, generally begin from some glimpse or intuition of the innermost sense of this thing that you want to convey. It might come to you for the first time in a kind of epiphany of, say, a scene or a plot idea or a character or a theme. Even if it isn't contained in the initial thrust of your writing process, there inevitably comes a point as you're writing where it's gifted to you as a kind of revelation, and you suddenly have this vision, if only a very tenuous one, of what this writing is supposed to be. Then you really start to write. And that revelation, that feeling begins to build around your initial idea like a seed, growing in complexity and urgency and immediacy as you go. That exhilarating process of clothing spirit with flesh, of inhaling life into a mere jumble of black marks on a page, drawing worlds and characters and stories entire out of the great dark void. This is what we love about writing. This is what keeps us coming back to the page again and again, despite the obvious reasons we have to give up this ludicrous business and to occupy ourselves with more sensible and lucrative pursuits. And yet, when we turn to the revising phases of our writing, we suddenly, for some unaccountable reason, decide to give up all of this energy and life. We try to transform ourselves into robotic editing machines. The attempt is futile, and it will lead us to nothing better than weariness and frustration. Worse still, it neatly divides our authorly experience into two distinct epochs. The first, the generally invigorating process of writing, and the second, the consistently enervating process of editing. To the extent that we embrace this model, we're establishing a negative feedback loop in our very work cycle, which encourages us to just skip over the painful revising process and to go as fast as we can to the joyful writing of some new project. We are not only condemning ourselves to hours of mindless drudgery, but we are also endangering some of the finest pleasures and some of the most productive and important parts of the writing process itself. Let's just cut the dead mass off altogether, shall we? Let's get rid of editing altogether. I want to introduce you to the writer's wheel. This is the schema that I've developed in order to conceptualize and visualize all the things that we've discussed here. Your writing is here envisioned as a circle or sphere formed by concentric rings or layers. Each of the rings or layers is permeable. It communicates with every other and permits movement of awareness in both directions. Each outer layer is strictly dependent on all the layers beneath it. Each inner layer gains further expression through the layers surrounding it. The two outermost layers represent the extremity of this expression, the most superficial and immediately visible part of your writing. The two innermost layers represent the most fundamental spirit of your writing, that bedrock upon which all the outer parts, without exception, depend for their life and quality. The reader of your work, and thus also the editor, begins with the surface, the exterior, the writing itself, and moves inward toward the interior life. The writer moves more in the opposite direction, from the secret life of this inspiration toward its fullest possible expression in the world. The reader's view, and thus also the editor's, tends to encounter first the specific and the concrete, and then infers or extrapolates the general from the specific. The writer's, on the other hand, encompasses both the specific and the general, the concrete and the global. The reader's and the writer's experiences, for all their differences, both flow originally and organically from the same central element, the core, the spirit, the heart of your writing. But only you, the writer, can have direct access to it. I say can. Our job is to transform that potential into an ongoing and revitalizing reality. Let's summarize our conclusions in light of this wheel. The editor starts at your work necessarily from the text, the outermost ring, and discovers or infers the deeper material from the text. Editors expect writers to do the same, but their advice only compounds the writer's basic challenge. You, the writer, have this difficulty. You've been inspired to bring something into the world, to clothe an invisible spirit in a concrete and visible form. This takes time and effort, a lot. By the time you finish this process, you've been so long entangled in its various complexities and fatigues that you've lost sight of the whole. In a certain way, you've forgotten the spirit which led you to write in the first place. All you can see any longer is the text, the words on the page, and you can't even see those very clearly. It's like you built a mansion that you can't remember how to get into. You find yourself locked outside of your own creation, beating helplessly against its facade. In a certain real and paradoxical way, the very text that you have produced is standing between you and the living fount of your creative act. Your writing is veiling the source of your inspiration. The common suggestions of editors and many writers about the self editing process, that is, to set your manuscript aside and to write detailed outlines of it, will not resolve this problem. Without due preparation, they might even exacerbate it. They're encouraging you to approach your text from an ever more external point of view. Though that is precisely the perspective that you are trying to get quit of. You shouldn't be trying to get out of your text to see it from some kind of ideal, objective perspective. You should be trying to get back into the very centermost core of your text, to work with it from that point. Access to that unseen core is your right as an author. It is the unseen core which grants life, unity, and being to your entire work in all of its complexities and different aspects. That spiritual core is what will remain embedded in your reader's head after he's finished your work. It's what will haunt him months and months after he's turned the last page. It's the one thing that can take all of the many characters and events and actions and dialogues and sections and chapters of your book and forge them together into a single unified work of art. It's even what determines the appropriateness of your specific word choice and your style and your narrative tone. It's the center of gravity of everything. And so it should, by rights, be the central dynamo of your revision process. But it's not anything that you can describe or articulate. This makes it hard to work with. We're going to come at it indirectly. I want you to think of a book that you particularly love, one that you know intimately, one that you've read several times. The sort of book that you don't give up once you put it down. I want you to bring this book into your mind. Don't focus on any character or any scene or any passage of it. Just bring it into your mind as if it were a presence or a personality, a kind of reality there within your mental space. Focus on the feel of it, the character as it sits there in your mind's eye. Once you have a sense of it, I want you to write down about a dozen associations that come to mind with it. Don't overthink this. Write down whatever pops into your head, your most immediate impressions, even if it seems strange. And when you've made up this list, I want you to take a look at it, reflect on it a little. Is there anything that stands out here as being odd or unexpected? Does anything seem central or deterministic in some way of the book? Does this list offer you a kind of impressionistic portrait of the work that you're dealing with? How does the world act as a filter or a conduit to this spiritual sense that you've in some way attempted to encapsulate? Are there any characters or moments or events in the book that don't quite fit in with this portrait, stand in contrast to it? How does their presence relate to it, and how does it contribute to your experience as a reader? Are they distractions? Are they detrimental to the course of the book? Or do they actually refer us back to its core, only negative? Do they act as spice, chiaroscuro, a useful foil for the innermost spirit of the work? You'll find with well-crafted works that the law of this center regulates the life of the whole in all of its elements, be they great or small, harmonious or discordant. If you're starting to get a sense of this vital core and how it contributes to the life of the whole work, then that's great. If you're still having problems, then try with another book and try and set these two books side by side to get a sense of how their different spirits or inner cores actually contrast with one another or relate to one another. If you do this enough, you'll start to get an idea of how every good piece of writing has its own sovereign soul, which differentiates it from every other and grants it its own special individuality. When you feel that you've met with some success at this, I want you to try the same thing with your own work. Think of your moments of inspired writing when you felt a river flowing through you that you couldn't have dammed up if you tried. Think of your moments of lucid intuition when some scene or character or atmosphere of your work invaded your heart. Think of the innermost core of your work, that living essence, which brought you into a fateful relationship with what is, to all scientific measures, a mere mass of wood pulp and ink. Think about the messages in your work, the things you want to convey, the lessons or teachings that it might contain. Think about the feeling that you want to leave impressed in your reader's imagination when he's done with your book. And write down the associations that come into your mind with all of these things. Try not to focus on plot, try not to think about character or scenes or specific events. Describe the feeling, the breadth of it, the inspiration that this work contains. Write spontaneously, first associations that come to mind. Here again, don't shy away from the strange or the unexpected or even the absurd. These kinds of connections can often be the most illuminating. So go ahead, put this video on pause, take your time, and write down a list of associations. When you've done so, take a look at your list. Do any of these elements seem to you to be particularly important? Do they stand out with a certain insistency? Underline or highlight these. Make a note as well of anything unexpected or strange. You can absolutely reflect on these and use them as the basis for further investigation, further exploration of your work. But for now, I want you to learn to just sit with the feeling. If you can learn to call it up into your heart and your mind at will and make it reflexive, then you can bring it to bear on any of the problems in your work. When you have a clear enough idea of all of this, you feel that you've developed a good, solid sense of the innermost core of your work. I want you to sit down before a blank piece of paper and I want you to try to write a condensed synopsis of your entire book. This isn't for marketing purposes. This isn't a blurb, so don't think about anybody who's going to be reading this. This is a concentrated description of the book that you decided you wanted to write, that you want to send out into the world and into the hearts and minds of other people. What is the meaning of this book? What's its why? What are the most important questions of the story and the characters? What's at stake in your writing? Why did you decide to write it at all? Why do you care so much that you spent all of this time and energy in bringing this thing to life? And I want you to write this description as much as possible, thinking of it through the lens of the spirit of your work. Consider what words you might use to evoke that spirit, how you might present your book in its light. You might want to use some of the associations that you jotted down or associations from those associations. Try to keep this to a single page or less. When you finish writing it, read through it as many times as you need to, correcting, trimming, slimming it down, until you feel that it is as polished a spiritual representation of your book as is possible. I hope that these preliminary exercises have been helpful. Please leave some comments down below to tell me what you thought of them. In future videos, we're going to be seeing how to take this spiritual core of your work and put it to practical use for us in actually revising your manuscript. You're going to work on your writing no longer from the outside in, but from the inside out, relying on those most formative aspects of your book and proceeding toward those which are most outwardly expressive. We're going to learn how to revolutionize the self-editing process, transforming it into a process of revisioning your work, of seeing your work anew through the creative vision of the artist and no longer through the critical lens of the editor. And we're going to start by putting the spiritual essence or core of your work into relation with what I call the three fundamentals of your writing. That is to say, world, character, and plot. I hope you'll join me because now we're ready to really get down to work. I hope you've enjoyed this video, which is part of the new site self-editing course for fiction writers. If you would like to gain access to the supplementary material for this course, you can sign up for it for free at the link in the description. This material includes written work for each section of this course, along with several explanatory notes. If you sign up, you will also have the chance to schedule a free consultation call with me to discuss your writing and your self-editing. I'd love to learn about any projects you're working on and to give you feedback from my perspective as a lifelong writer and a long-time professional editor. I hope to talk to you soon.